Hey guys, this is Lala Legacy and welcome back to another episode of Seabed. So we're gonna go through the tips first off. So let's go. The new ones that we got. I realized I'd been sleeping at my desk or at the desk of my examination room. The clock displayed the time as 10 p.m. I fixed up my hair, stood up, and took a can of beer from the fridge. I turned on my portable radio and after adjusting the volume, focused my attention on writing the daily report. I might have called it a report, but it was no more than a rough list of what had happened during the day, separated into a few sections. As such, I finished writing it with little difficulty. I also made a note on Sachiko's overall condition. She had yet to tell me anything vital. However, I felt like it was about time for me to act. With Takako gone, Sachiko came to live on her own. I had my doubts she could survive for long in her current condition. A song I used to listen to came on the radio. I paused it and took the open beer can from the side of the table, but it was already empty. I stood up, walked to the freezer, and took out another can. I opened it, and after taking a gulp, shifted my gaze to the little window in the corner of the room. I could see the moon shining brightly in the cloudless sky. The sight made me calm down a little. I flipped through the pages of one of my medical records I brought from the library. The early reports really did look more like a diary than anything. It was full of stories about Sachiko, me, and her usual companion Takako. I'd see Sachiko maybe once or twice a year after we graduated elementary school, but Takako seemed to have been with her for the entire time. Those two were quite peculiar characters, to say the least. Yes. As I finished reading the page, I realized the volume of the radio had gone down. As I glanced at the radio, I saw that the red lamp indicating the life of the two AA batteries powering it had grown dim. It was about to go out completely. I considered removing the batteries and putting them back in. I even toyed with the idea of just shaking the radio. It was an old thing, though. With certain parts of it already rusted away, so I ultimately changed my mind. I finished listening to the distorted sound of the radio with a beer can in one hand, then focused on finishing my report. After a while, I realized I could hear a faint sound alongside the scraping noise of my pen against the paper. I paused, raised my head, and strained my ears to listen. It was coming from somewhere close by. The more I listened, the more it sounded like someone's voice. I had no idea who was talking or what was being said, but it felt like that someone had been whispering somewhere in the vicinity. I took a closer look at the radio, thinking it might have honed in on some weird wavelength, but its light had already gone completely dark. I considered the possibility of the sounds from Sachiko's room traveling all the way here due to some peculiarity of the mansion's design. Although I could no longer hear anything, urged by my curiosity, I left the room. I had a slightly bad feeling on my way to Sachiko's room. It felt as though the corridor was colder than usual. The closer I got to her room, the colder it felt, and the worse my feeling of premonition became. My first thought upon reaching her room was to open the door. However, I then realized that there was no light coming from her room, and it was pretty much the middle of the night. I decided to first check if there were any sounds coming from the room first. Placing my ear against the door, I listened in. I felt like I could vaguely hear something when I was walking toward the room, but now it had fallen into complete silence. After spending another minute or so listening, I still heard no voices whatsoever. I began to wonder if it hadn't just been my imagination playing tricks on me all along. In the end, I pulled back from the door and gave it a light knock. There was no answer. I unlocked the door and slowly pushed it open to make a small gap, all the while careful not to make a sound. The cold seeping out from inside made my skin tingle. The faint ray of light making its way inside from the corridor gave the pitch-black room some color. I stopped pushing the door by the time the light reached up to the bed, and strained my eyes as I looked into the darkness. However, Sachiko wasn't there. I pushed the door open and entered the room. Sachiko was nowhere to be seen. Oh boy, what did you do, Sachiko? That was a short one. Okay, so I think we gotta go to the bedroom now, right? Yes, here we go. No matter where I looked, Sachiko was nowhere to be found. I considered the possibility of having mistaken the rooms, but after taking a better look, the sheets on the bed were obviously wrinkled. I tried coming up with the most likely possibilities for Sachiko not being there. It wasn't exactly the time to go outside, but perhaps she couldn't sleep and wanted to take a walk in the night. However, I also had the feeling it wouldn't be something so simple. I returned my attention to the room. It was much colder in there than out in the corridor, but its window was closed. I couldn't quite understand how that could have happened. However, I felt like the room held the answers to her disappearance. As such, I decided to investigate it. The room seemed even darker than usual. I could barely make out the contours of the plants in the corner. It was possible that my eyes were just tired, or there was something else I didn't think of, but I had a bad feeling about this. As I raised my face after checking the other side of the bed, I finally realized there was something left on top of it. It was the book that Sachiko used to read all the time after coming here. I picked it up to realize it was not a book, but rather a notebook with a leather cover. There was nothing written on either the cover or the back. I checked its weight with one hand. After a quick glance around the room, I returned my attention to the notebook. I felt hesitant to read her personal notes, but I had no other leads. Besides, Sachiko had never left it like this before. I made up my mind and opened it. There was no separate sections to indicate schedules. Instead, it was just a regular notebook with ruled lines. One neatly handwritten line followed the other, making up sentence after sentence. I failed to buy the extra cheap cuttlefish for 100 yen, so I bought the 2 sea breams for 200 yen instead. I paid 100 yen for my daikon, but then found one at the grocery store that only cost 80. It's probably best to buy your fruit and vegetables at places like that. I went on a drive to the mountains with Sachiko. On our way back, Sachiko spotted a pussy willow. When I plucked one of its branches for ourselves, she worriedly asked if it was okay. But when we got home, she decorated our entrance with it. Sachiko's name came up, so I assumed this note was most likely written by Takako. At first, the note seemed to be mostly about cooking, but as they went on, I realized she was noting down every single detail with little to no consistency. The date on the first page was from a year ago, and the notes continued jumping ahead days, sometimes even weeks, until they suddenly ceased, leaving most of the notebook blank. I checked the later pages to confirm if it was really blank, then flipped through the entire thing again, trying not to get too caught up in the details. There was a point where the writings suddenly changed. It seemed like some of these were written by Sachiko. The room suddenly grew completely dark. Turning around, I noticed that the door had closed behind me. Thinking that Sachiko might have returned, I closed the notebook. But it wasn't anywhere near as nice. As my eyes slowly grew to the dark, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Is it Takako? The foliage plants by the door had disappeared. The bookshelf changed into a wardrobe, and there was now a new closet by the wall. Before I knew it, I was standing in a completely unfamiliar room. I felt a bitter chill rise up my spine as I confirmed that the notebook in my hands hadn't changed. I turned around to see an unfamiliar bed with curtains. I pulled one of the curtains aside and looked at the bed. Takako was sleeping there with Sachiko nestled against her. What was going on? Trying to keep up with this unexpected situation, I gave my surroundings another scrutinizing look. I started with Takako's face. My intuition told me that Takako wasn't exactly alive. Then I realized I had missed something. The date on the first page of the notebook was last year. In other words, this notebook might contain a description of Takako's death. I wonder why I failed to realize that as soon as I saw the date. But then again, weirder things had been happening around me tonight. I couldn't blame my head for not being able to keep up. As I was organizing my thoughts, Sachiko slightly moved. Her eyelids slowly opened. And the whole thing faded away. I felt like time itself had stopped. Before long, however, I found myself transported back to the familiar confines of room 208. Well, dang. Okay. So, that's a little more insight of what really happened to Sachiko and Takako. And why is Nagasaki, like, seeing these things? But let's go back to the actual, like, main story. After glancing out the window one more time, I sat down on the bed. I had a vine-like canopy that seemed to be carved out of wood. I took off my shoes and stretched my legs. After I was done with that, I joined my fingers and stretched my arms next. You had to step down from the sill to reach the floor, which was at a slightly lower level than the door itself. The interior furniture was of an old Western design. The green one-seater Victorian sofa had an acanthus sleeve design carved into its leg. The color of the sofa's mahogany armrest had faded over time and looked almost black at certain spots. That said, its springs seemed to be in perfect condition, and with the tall backrest, the whole thing was a pleasure to sit on. I spotted a small chest on the cabinet that had the carving of a lion on its side. An ivy plant was positioned on top of it, covering its upper half with vines. Oh, that's pretty. The white porcelain cup made an elegant clang as I put it back down on the saucer. Ah, that's right. I remember that year. I came back and found the entire place covered in heaps of snow. Hardly something I'd forget considering how little it snows around these parts. Time sure flies, doesn't it? That was how Nanai replied when I brought up the year we met. Thank you for showing me around at that time. Who knows where I would have ended up without your help. Oh, don't sweat it! Nanai made a mischievous smile. The blackwood table in the middle of the dining room had engravings of ivies and cosmos flowers on the sides. It was supported by spindle legs, whose shape reminded me of dewdrops. So, do you like it? Like what? Our mansion! Yes, it is quite something. I'm glad it didn't disappoint. I expected a smaller place since you told me you managed it alone. I'm not really doing it alone. My auntie's also here. And during peak seasons, we hire part-timers from the town to help out. Unfortunately, we don't have a hot spring on the premises, so there aren't that many customers around this time of the year. She let out a sigh. Phone. I see. That explains why you have time to have dinner with me. That's the long and short of it, yeah. Cheerfulness returned to Nanai's features. Honestly, I don't give a shit about the phone right now. A gust of wind suddenly swept through the room, making the candle lights between Nanai and myself flicker. Do you always use candles for lighting here? No, those are for special occasions. Don't you find it romantic? There was a dark window on the wall behind an eye. Upon giving it a closer look, I spotted the shadows of tree leaves fluttering in the darkness like wavelets in the night sea. With the table taking up most of the entire space of the relatively narrow, candlelit dining room, it almost felt like, I felt almost like I was in the cabin of some western ship. It's like we're sailing in a ship. If that's the case, I hope it's a merchant vessel. Why? It costs a fortune to transport all this furniture from overseas. I see. Have you acquired anything new lately? A few things as usual. Our ship's not departing tonight. We're resupplying on water and foodstuff right now. And once that's done? Well, the wind looks favorable and there's not a single cloud in the sky. We could sail at any time if that's your wish. Nanai let out a hearty sailor-like guffaw. Are you always like that? Nanai asked after we both calmed down. No way. Takako was like that, always like that. Oopsie, blah blah blah. Takako was always like that though, I added. This sounds like a fun person to be around. Shame I didn't get to meet her. I bet you two would have hit it off. Nanai made an amiable smile again. She seemed to possess an entire repertoire of smiles and knew how to use them. As a result, I ended up revealing more than I originally intended. I shut my mouth and shifted my gaze to the window behind her. Beyond the huge shadow of the mountain, bright stars decorated the night sky. It really was a huge mansion. I couldn't imagine how Nanai, who was more or less my age, ended up owning such a place. You said your auntie was also working here, but what about your parents? I don't have any. My mother passed away when I was little, and as far as I know, my father ran off before I was even born. Nanai said that as though it was nothing. I see. Nanai made another smile, perfectly attuned to the situation. It didn't seem like she was bothered, so it would have been odd for me to apologize. Not knowing what to do, I shifted my attention to the food. Oh, it's all so pretty! Steam billowed forth from the boiled radish as I used my chopsticks to slice one. I put it in my mouth, tasting its warmth. You prepared quite a feast today. I could smell the mouth-watering, salty, sweet aroma of this well-seasoned meat and potato stew. Among most of the plates on the table, besides the radish, there was also one for sea bream sashimi, with shiso leaves. I picked up an oyster from another plate and put it in my mouth, feeling its gentle sweetness spread across my tongue. Takako was not a fan of the taste, and would always move oysters to my plate. Don't be shy to speak up if there's anything you don't like, and you don't need to eat everything. I'll happily finish your leftovers. I'm not particularly picky about my food, thank you. I felt the slippery texture of the oyster in my mouth. A mellow sweetness enveloped my tongue as I bit through the flesh. The fact Takako disliked this was still baffling to me. I let my gaze settle on the flickering candle lights up in the gently swaying chandelier as I reminisced. The two candle holders lined up on the table seemed to be designed in a fashion similar to the chandelier. I recalled seeing an almost identical chandelier in the lobby room too. Gentle orange light illuminated the room. Did you find any good furniture that day? Nanai looked up from her food, momentarily ceasing her attempts to separate a portion of the fish from a stubborn bone using only her chopsticks. Yeah, I got really lucky that day. I managed to find a mahogany sofa and a writing desk with glass doors. The sofa is actually the one in your room. I recalled the green Victorian sofa I saw in my room. You have good taste. Thanks! From the other side of the table, I could see Nanai flash another smile. I heard the brief rattling of the windows. The wind must have picked up a bit. It's just seasonal wind, said Nanai. I shifted my gaze to the window. In these parts, the winds get stronger around the same time every year. Don't worry though, it won't blow the entire building over or anything. I'm glad to hear that. But that is all the time that I have for this episode, guys, so if you liked it, please give it a big thumbs up down below. And if you haven't already, subscribe. By subscribing, you're becoming part of a legacy. I love you guys so much, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!